Hello and welcome to the SciFirst MovieTalk episode. So in this episode I'll be discussing the third movie released in the Scream franchise, the 2000 movie Scream 3, as once again directed by Wes Craven, but this time around written by Ehren Kruger, based on an initial draft of a script by Kevin Williamson. Now, when it was released, given the hype and attention that the first two movies kind of had in the franchise, you would have expected that regardless of the film's quality, people would have flocked to see this. It would have fared pretty well, right? However, it didn't go on to have anything like the same success as its predecessors, both financially nor critically. And I do remember that at the time there just wasn't anything like the same kind of buzz that there was for this movie that there had been in the past. I think initially the series started to suffer from its own success, in that between the first and the third film there had been so many copycat movies, all fashioned in a very similar vein. As much as I wanted to see more Scream specifically, I must admit that the market at the time, it did feel saturated. It had become a victim of its own success. Unfortunately, however, this movie did nothing to sway the moviegoers into believing it was going to offer anything new at all that they hadn't seen before. Where the original Scream set a new bar for horror, this entry seemed to kind of be content in recycling old ground, which unfortunately many other films had already done by this point. So Scream 3 is set some time after the events of the second movie, serving both as a direct sequel to both the first and the second movies, if you like, where we now catch up with Sidney Prescott, as played by Neve Campbell, after having survived the events of the first two movies, now living in isolation in the mountains, working as a phone-in crisis counsellor. However, a new series of murders occur surrounding the production of a new movie called Stab 3, Return to Woodsboro, which is part of a fictional movie franchise following the events of the Scream series set within the Scream universe itself. Somebody else has now taken up the Ghostface mantle, and events seem once again to be repeating themselves this time around, aimed at the cast and crew of the upcoming movie, but with an aim and desire to bring Sidney back out into the open for some reason. One by one, as the body count once again mounts up, Sidney must face her worst fears and delve into the past, as events seem to be coming back round full circle, as this latest killer takes the lives of yet more of her friends. So, I have to be fair, although I am probably going to pick a fault with this movie quite a bit, this is in relation to its place in the Scream franchise as it sits sequentially. As a slasher movie in its own right, it's not too bad. It's certainly got some entertaining moments, and at least it's not as dry or as dull as perhaps it could have been, It has a lighter touch than the previous two movies in the franchise, opting for more of a comedic approach. But as a result, I think the horror elements really do seem kind of very much watered down, and there is little in the way of the clever use of horror tropes and references that we had seen in the previous two movies. There is way more situational and prop comedy than its predecessors, and perhaps even an over-reliance on it, over the horror elements, You can certainly tell that this one has had its wings clipped, and I think that is what has happened here. For the most part, it does a good job with the returning characters in the main, especially Sidney, without who I don't think this would have been anything even half of what it is, even with David Arquette and Courtney Cox reprising their roles as Dewey Riley and Gail Weathers respectively. Campbell is at least carries, her role, she at least carries a strong role forward, and we see her strength increase as she attacks the menace that has plagued her life for so long, head on. Arquette and Cox, they do bring some very much needed energy into the mix, but their story arc, it seems like it's going round in circles, and it probably is more of a running gag, perhaps, now. We've seen it all before, though, and all that kind of tantamounts to name-calling and bickering in this one, which does kind of get a bit tiresome. And, be warned, Courtney Cox screams a lot. Way more than she has done in the previous installments. Not quite as fearless as she was once portrayed, perhaps. The story does seem very tried and tested, played very safe, and a bit repetitive. I've always thought that the film, within a film concept, was a bit corny. I think it worked in the second as it was only kind of part of the backdrop. But in this movie, we are literally inside the movie. And if I'm honest, I think the whole thing kind of cheapens the rest of the story. Which, in fairness, apart from kind of rewriting what we know about the events in the first movie, which had then the movie falling into the same pit that the series was kind of set up to avoid, it was quite intriguing altogether. That part is good. That part kind of stands up, I think. But it really does feel like all we have is a load of people kind of running around in circles, screaming their heads off. The first two movies never felt like that. The horror was presented with a much more kind of style and finesse in those. The film within a film thing had even been done before, right? You know, by Craven in his 1994 movie New Nightmare, and to much better effect. So this never kind of felt like it was stepping out to do something new, even in that respect. We even have a cheap nightmare dream sequence, just for good measure, which all just felt at kind of odds with the tone and the class of the previous two. And to top it all off, we actually have a number of Hollywood cameos. Quirky as they are, this time around, the pop culture's not even subtle, which was one of kind of the best bits of the original two, bar the suspense, of course. It wasn't in your face. You really had to work for some of those references. And this movie has very little going for it in that aspect. It really does. The new characters aren't worth anything at all. We never really spend that much time with them to develop them as characters any deeper than face value. They are simply fodder in this case. They really are. Which means that none of the kills, apart from a sparing few, have any emotional or empathetic connection at all. Which really does make everything feel all but a little bit pointless, you know? Williamson's absence is felt here, 100%. Gone is his quirky and often insightful life commentary. If they had really kind of invested in these characters as they had done in the previous movies, even with a more comedic approach, I think this would have raised the intensity of the movie tenfold. Instead, for at least the first half, you know? It really just does kind of churn along, feeling very, very clunky at times. A bit like my reviews. Clunky reviews. Things do kind of ramp up in the second half, though, and when the original trio kind of put back into the thick of it, I do think it does start to turn and kind of corner and kind of come around full circle. There is a nice change of pace with the use of a voice scrambler used by Ghostface, which I thought was a nice evolution, and it can be quite edgy at times. It's, of course, still quite fun to try and guess who the killer is on the first go-around, of course. It's just no longer a trailblazer, you know, in its genre for me. Unlike the first two movies. There isn't just as much rewatch value in this one, I don't think. It is the one I've seen the least, and I think even the one that kind of does feel most dated, even though it's one of the later ones as we're going along. Overall, Scream 3 doesn't present itself as a bad slasher movie. It certainly has some enjoyable moments and a great cast, absolutely. Well, at least for those that actually make an impact. And some workable ideas against the events of the previous two movies in the series that I think, in the end, were plausible enough for what they tried to do with the overall plot of the franchise as a whole. So I can't argue with any of that. But the original had an element of honesty, integrity, being set in a real-world setting, so to speak. The horror was attainable and perhaps even relatable to some extent. It was just about a small town being terrorised by an unknown killer. However, Scream 3, being set against the backdrop of Hollywood and integrated with the production of a fictional movie, Stab 3, just makes it feel distant, at arm's length. And together with the overuse of comedy and cheap cameos, it makes this one feel more like an outsider within the franchise, you know? It just doesn't have the creativity, the pacing or emotion of the previous two movies. It's just not as smart as it tries to make us think that it is. So, that brings me to the end of this episode. Many thanks for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please leave a like. Please do hit that subscribe button for more movie reviews, trailer reactions and other movie-related content. Absolutely loved having you here at SciFirst Movie Talk and definitely love to have you back. Most of all, just thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.